Yes.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you so much for joining us. And before we begin, I would just like to point out that this session is being recorded and we encourage you to be very, very interactive. So throughout the session, feel free to have your camera on, feel free to unmute yourself and join in the conversation. It's not meant to be a presentation at you, it's meant to be a conversation with you. And that's why we do these discussion circles. So, as you know, the topic we have today is transforming with design thinking. My name is Gunjan Syal, and I'm your host. I'm also the founder and direction advisor at Transform This. I'll get into the goal of Transform This in a second, but I'm also the transformation executive at Emerald Technology Group Inc. Currently, I'm supporting my clients with strategy, governance, and planning needs on their transformations. We need a lot of change in our companies and in our lives with COVID and the pandemic world that we're living in. Today with me, I'm so glad to have Ramya. Ramya is a senior data scientist at Loblaw and a very good friend of mine. We've had so many interesting conversations, both as women in technology and women in this world that we're living in these days with the remote world. Ramya, would you like to please introduce yourself?
Sure. So I would just like to add that I'm passionate about natural language processing in general and interpretability of AI and my newfound love, which is design thinking. So these are my areas of, I would not say expertise, but I would say the things that I'm passionate about.
Yeah, things that we're all exploring, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
Absolutely. And Ramya, we were talking about the painting that's right behind you.
Oh, yeah. So I wanted to choose this location of my house because this painting, in a sense, it symbolizes creativity. So it has all the creations of Leonardo da Vinci. So I mean, if it's visible to people, but it's just that I wanted to choose this location because I felt that this is in line with the kind of topic that we are going to discuss today. So so here's my painting, not my painting, of course, but here's the location where I am. So
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ramya. So diving right in, today we will be talking about design thinking, and we thought we'll talk about three main things that you can take away from this session. And the first one is, why is design thinking essential for transformations? Then Ramya would talk about what are the principles of design thinking that we should be leveraging, especially given the third point, which is the COVID condition that we are in, and also sharing with you some of the successful case studies as examples of design thinking. And if these are some of the things that you've been exploring at your organizations, as I said earlier, please feel free to jump in and share your thoughts and your experience with us. You will also notice our contact information on the slide to continue the discussion with us after we're done with the session, we've gone away, something sometimes comes to mind. So feel free to share that with us. So just diving right in, there's a lot of focus on customers, right? When we think about transformation or even in the pandemic world, when we are delivering items or services. But we often forget how much focus there needs to be in the company to organize ourselves a little bit differently, to deliver things in a faster way. Especially, Ramya, you and I were chatting about this before the session. The focus that data has taken on, like the data trend was already in the market, but now with COVID, there's different type of data that's been collected, right? It's a new trend. So to analyze that data, to make decisions using that data, and then to deliver something new requires a new way of thinking. And to me, that's where design thinking really comes in. So today we're focusing on the strategy and the planning pieces, which design thinking touches upon, right? Anything to add, Ramya?
absolutely. So this is, I call it more of a structural disruption.
Hmm.
And we'll be talking about this. I would be talking about what is change and change versus transformation, and why design thinking is required at this moment in time. So uh, you know, next slide, please.
Yeah, should we
Because
dive
I've
in?
introduced. Yeah, so we must design for the way people behave, not for how we would wish them to behave. So this essentially touches the most essential part of design thinking, which is a human centric design. And before I start talking about design thinking, I would like to start with an anecdote. And this is coming from David Kelly, the former CEO of IDEO. Um, so if you have explored the area of design thinking, you must have heard about David Kelly and his the work that he did for Steve Jobs.
Mm,
So he starts off by saying that creativity is not something that you can be teaching a human being. It's something that is innate, something that is inside a human being. But what happens is that during, the, like, as life progresses, we meet people who kind of say that, oh, what you have done is not that good, when we're trying to highlight the creative side of us, and because of which we start, you know feeling less confident about expressing the creativity in us. And that leads to kind of, it acts as a stumbling block. So I would like to, explain this further with an anecdote. So there's this kid, um, who just takes a clay, like the teacher provides him the clay, and he starts making a horse. And now, this is a story that David Kelly narrates to substantiate what he's saying about human beings. So he says, so the child starts creating a horse, and there's a girl sitting beside him, and she says, "Oh, this does not look like a horse." And that's when the child feels less confident about what he created. And
right.
throughout the the rest of his life, he starts identifying himself as a non-creative person, which is actually not true. Another thing I would want to talk about is David Kelly in 2007 was diagnosed with throat cancer, and at
Mm,
that time, his he started writing a book which is called as, um, Creative Confidence. So it's a very beautiful concept, and what that means is, um, people are creative in general. You don't have to teach people to be creative, but then what you got to do is remove those stumbling blocks from the path to creativity. So that is the essential thing that he talks about in his book, and he wrote that book with his brother Tom Kelly.
yeah, so
So
Ramya, sorry to interrupt there. Biju just put something in the chat. Biju, would you like to share it with everyone? Would you like to unmute yourself and talk about the empathy piece that you mentioned? Biju, are you there? Okay, we can't seem to hear Biju, but he basically mentioned, Ramya, great quote. Empathy is about meeting people where they are and not where we want them to be. And I think that's the important distinction you were pointing out as well. Oh, Ramya, you're on mute.
sorry, I put
No
myself.
worries.
So that's a very beautiful statement that Biju made. So, and it actually transcends to the next slide where I talk about uh, design thinking. So there are three essential pillars of design thinking. One is empathy, second is creativity, and rationality. So I would like to map that to the concept of design thinking. So when I talk about empathy, what does that mean? It means
Mm,
that you, in the process of design thinking, you start looking at your users, the end users. And a very a nice example that David Kelly gives, I'm sorry I'm bringing him again and again, because he's the founder of D School at Stanford, which emphasizes on design thinking. So he talks about giving an assignment to his students to develop an app for the transit users, the users who use the transit trains. So what he says is, when we talk about empathy, it is trying to understand the users. It's like observing how the users kind of use the transit, the train as such. How do they commute, and what happens during the process of planning? What do they do when they're traveling? Like before traveling, they need to plan. So what goes into that? So observing your users. So in terms of business, how does that translate to? It translates to creating user research studies, where you are asking open-ended questions to your users to understand them better. What do they actually need? And this actually points towards the other point that I've mentioned about being open to ditching the preconceived notions, because as businesses, we are not supposed to have some sort of preconceived notions about users. And as human beings, of course, it's psychological for us to have preconceived notions, where we start thinking that, oh, maybe our users behave in this way,
Right.
or maybe.
Especially now, right? With COVID,
Exactly.
so many
Exactly.
changing things.
Yes, and users are supposed to think in a certain way. No, we have to ditch those preconceived notions if we want to truly embrace this beautiful concept of design thinking. So going back to the empathy piece, it's observing your users. It's trying to understand what your users actually want.
Right.
Now, the second element, which is creativity, is about coming up with ideas, and that's an essential step in the design thinking process. But then it's you know like having a brainstorming session, bringing your team members, and discussing, okay, given that this is our problem, the problem that you have iteratively come up with by observing your users, how do I solve it? So what are the different ways of solving it? So that's the element of creativity. And rationality is when you have a plethora of ideas in front of you, you try to assess those ideas, as in which ones would work for your business and which ones would not work for your business. So the rationality behind implementing or going behind a certain idea, so that is the rationality piece.
Right.
And if you look at the third point I mentioned about business, technology, and human value, it's another way of looking at these three pillars that I've already talked about. So the human value could be mapped to empathy, technology piece could be mapped to creativity, and the rationality is the business element. That is, how could we leverage this to, or translate it to some business metrics? So, yeah. Do we have any comments now, Gunjan?
Yeah, actually, I was going to ask. I can already see some people that I recognize from previous sessions. I see Christopher. We've been talking about design thinking offline on LinkedIn as well. So, Chris, how are you using design thinking these days? What type of conversations are you having internally? And how do they relate to or differ from what we have shared here so far?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Gunjan. Yeah, I think this is a really, really hot topic these days, and especially with this pandemic, we really need this type of approach. And it's really interesting how many companies worldwide is, adopting this design thinking approach. And well, I think we have been talking about this one, and I think the main goal here is to guide what is useful for you. This is like a framework. So it's not like it's mandatory to use all the steps, but you need to identify which one will be the most useful for your company.
That's a very good point, right? It's just like any other methodology, right? People in past have talked about agile, scaled agile, right? Even data science has a chart. I'm sure Ramya is very, very familiar with that one being in her role. So there's all these different things that are meant to be frameworks. But the important piece is going back to that first point, right? That Ramya mentioned, the empathy, creativity, and rationality. How does that apply
That's
to your business and your industry? So I know
yeah,
Gary.
and I can
Go
yeah,
ahead.
I can also add that the second point is that the mindset you need to implement this type of framework. You know, it's totally different approach. What we are, you know, last meeting we were talking about, you know, like type of the old school mindset and how we should try to improve those. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was just gonna type to Biju. Biju and Chris seem like on the chat they have an ESP thing going on because Biju just mentioned judgment gets in the way of this process, right? And the constraints of free thinking, it really helps to drive the creativity mindset forward. Any other thoughts or comments? I know we have Gary who represents retail, similar to Ramya as well. Gary, any thoughts from you on how retail in general may or may not be using design thinking right now?
All I would say is that I think there's a great rush in any business, particularly in retail, to innovate. And in some ways, I think that many people fall into the trap of they understand what innovation looks like and how to apply design thinking within that framework, when I think the word innovate is open to so much interpretation. But when they proceed to move down an innovative path to try and change maybe a retail concept or make some amendments to their proposition, it's they may be led into a linear process, because most of business is linear. You kind of, you place your order, you get the stuff into your warehouse, you move it to the store, somebody comes and buys it. It's very linear. Whereas I think that my understanding of design thinking is it's very iterative, and therefore it's very unlinear, and it's something which it doesn't require a hugely creative mind to be in the design thinking process or design thinking. I'm trapped by my own wording, but the design thinking approach, let's call it that.
Yeah.
That the worst thing is to believe that all you have to do is set some guys in an innovation lab and go, right, you start here, that's the goal, get on with it. And I think that that's where innovation labs, given that kind of outline, can fail miserably. And when we don't even have the luxury of an innovation lab, we're trying to do it while on the side of a desk. That innovation, as I say, is forward into thinking. People around it are forward into thinking. It's a linear process. You start with A, you do B, you do C, and out comes something really rather marvelous.
Absolutely true. And then POC to that point, right? Building that further. She also says, I'm sorry, I'm assuming that POC is a female male. I shouldn't make that assumption. So POC says, this is why we need to have a diverse team to think of the wide range of our users. We need a wide range of designers and developers. And I think that's very, very true, right? I'm actually reminded of words from Andrew Ng, who a lot of data people are very familiar with, right? He's the founder of Coursera, deep thinking, AI, and a lot of those type of things. And he has been, as a leader, going out in the market and looking at people from different backgrounds and diverse thinking to come in and join those creative, call it algorithm, call it maybe Ramya can better inform us there, the ML models that come into place. If you don't use the right data to train them, then you'd fail miserably and create problems later. And we have seen that lately in the market, even during COVID, right, Ramya?
Yes. So I would like to say something, add something to Box's point. It's not just diversity in the team, because that lends creativity. But the other pillar, which is the empathy pillar, there you need to consider users from different backgrounds. So if you're designing an app for, let's say, air travel, you got to know who are the different type of users, not only in terms of the way they use air travel. For example, you have business travelers, you have travelers from, let's say, who travel for leisure. And also there are these ethnic differences or cultural differences in your user base that you've got to understand. So I would say that diversity is not only part of creativity, that is your team, but it also is in terms of the user base that you're considering, the empathy piece. So diversity is so to speak, part of these two pillars.
Absolutely. So what I'll do now is move on to some next slides because our conversation's naturally moving towards them, Ramya.
Yes,
So
yes,
I'm thinking
yes.
we should dive into it.
Sure. So Gary's point about this process being non-linear, absolutely love that point, because yes, this process is non-linear because it's in line with human psychology, right? So when you talk about five-step process, you don't stick to, that sort of a procedural approach where you empathize, you define, you ideate, you prototype, and you test, but you actually iteratively moving in this process, and you might move backwards or forward according to the results that you observe. So it's an extremely non-linear process when it comes to the flow as such. So I would like to describe each and every step here. So when we talk about empathize is, as I said, it's more about trying to understand the users. And what it translates to is trying to ask open-ended questions. For example, again, I come back to my example of designing an app for air travel. You try to ask people, okay, what is the part of your journey that you feel more stressed out about? So that's a very open-ended question. Instead of asking them pointed questions which might influence their answers, you ask them open-ended questions in your user study and try to understand what are the key challenges, problems that you could take up during your next phases. So empathizes, and also David Kelly uses the term bias towards action. Now, what does that mean? It means that you don't particularly lock yourself in a room, having meetings, saying that, okay, maybe user is stressed out about this aspect of the journey or that aspect of the journey. So ditching the preconceived notions part. Yes. So bias towards action is going out there and having clear interactions with users, somehow asking them questions and trying to understand what is that problem that they want you to solve. Now, the second step is define. So when we talk about define, it's like once you have all the answers in front of you, you try to create the persona, because there are so many personas, user personas, that come out of this process, of user research study. Then you start creating the personas and try to understand which is your dominant persona, right? So you want to generalize, create an app which is more generalized. So you'll try to find out what that major sort of persona is, and you try to define that as your problem. And one thing that is very beautiful about design thinking process, and it's like different from the other approaches, is that in general, the problem definition is in front of you. But here in design thinking, you're iteratively moving towards a problem statement. And that's what is wonderful and more humanistic, I would say, approach, because you are observing your users, you're coming up with the problem, but then you're asking the question, is this a problem? Is this really a problem that I should be solving? Or
Right.
is there a better problem definition? So there is a iterative process of refinement here. And that's what is very beautiful about this design thinking process. And in a way, it's very, very human, right? The next step in the process is ideate. So once you are at least a bit certain about your problem statement, you bring your team members and you start brainstorming on the ideas. And there are these, wow, that's the creative element. That's where the human being's true creativity comes out. So each member comes up with a beautiful idea, and then you make a list of those ideas. So that's, and it's in a way a cyclical process. That's what people talk about. So in design thinking, you're you're talking about a certain idea. You
Mm-hmm.
come up with a certain idea, but then it makes you ask questions, and in the process you might even go back to the definition stage, where you might think that the ideas that certain people are coming up with might not adequately address the problem that you have identified. So it means that your definition might not be that clear. So it's a very cyclical process. That's what cyclical way of thinking, coming up with ideas. And then once you are sure about your idea, you move on to the prototyping stage. So in the prototyping stage, let's say that you are trying to develop an application, an app for your users, then you have come up with certain clear cut ideas that you need to bring in, or the features that you want to bring in. So you create a sort of a prototype that has or embraces those ideas. And then finally you test it with your end user. You expose the user to the prototype that you have created, and then you start testing. You start noting down their you can say reaction, or the way they are, like, um, is there an adaptability? Are they adopting to your new platform that you're providing? Are they liking it? So you start assessing the um, the adaptation to the new platform that you've introduced.
Mm-hmm.
And
So,
once, yeah, sure.
sorry, Ramya, I do have a question for you about this now, because when I picture the COVID situation and the needs of customers changing so often,
Mhm.
I'm actually wondering how people can stay on top of that empathize piece, right? Because usually you would have, different teams within a company that would be responsible for this. But I personally feel like it's almost everybody's job at the moment to make sure that whatever they're working on aligns with that, the user needs, the empathizing with the customer at all times. So how do we go about finding that out these days? You can't have a direct conversation with customer. Like if I think about Loblaws, right? People walking
Mhm.
into the store, giving you the feedback at different places, whether they're in an aisle or if they're at the cashier. But there's this e-commerce push now. So how do we collect that feedback?
It's a great question. So that's that's what exactly happens when you have unforeseen situations. So
Mm-hmm.
you cannot rely on, as you rightly pointed out, there has been a structural disruption, right? So our past beliefs have to be now thrown away, because
Right.
whatever we understood about our users is not relevant now. They are now behaving in a different way. And much of it, of course, is very difficult to observe, because we don't have enough historical data to support the hypothesis that we come up with when it comes to user behavior. And
Mm-hmm.
in the light of this, we have to also understand that we are human beings as well, and we have some sort of expectations. So when it comes to any aspect of the life, it's not really representative of our users, but then still some aspects of us, we do mirror our users, right?
Right.
So one way would be to to start thinking about innovative ways of getting that feedback, of course, but also trying to, conduct some sort of study within the organization to understand different people. And large organizations, the I would say the advantage that they have is that they have a lot of people who are employees, and they are people nevertheless. So that's one approach. But I think this is the time when we start becoming more innovative. Because let's say that you talk about healthcare. So there, it's a very specific domain where your users particularly are not comfortable sharing their information. So
That's
um,
true.
so so you have to think of innovative ways of getting back the the feedback from the end users.
Yeah,
So
and Gary actually just pointed out that there are no structures, as you said, right, to solve that problem right
yeah,
now.
yeah.
Gary, would you like to explain that comment a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, my situation, I'm in transition, so it's very hard for me to actually say within companies with some authority. But what I see in two areas, one is commentary by observers of industry that they keep going back to, and I can see it through my own critical thinking. They're looking at things as if they want to go back to normal. They're trying to assign patterns to these economic data, or maybe shopping surveys, which are going on all the time, and trying to associate some importance to these in a way that they would have done in, prior to February. And I suspect retailers who may even get these surveys may instruct, commission surveys on customers coming through the stores, or by SurveyMonkey or however they get it, will still want to see these patterns in a framework that they understand, that they've used for 20 or 30 years maybe, and try to assign exactly those kind of values and approaches to that data to try and make them feel that they're still in control. And I think that the design thinking is actually saying, forget about all that, forget about what you knew. And this is a great, the whole lockdown and reopening process, certainly within retail, is like, you have to start again. You don't know. You don't know anything. All you've got is new data in front of you, and you have to now build new mental models of how to look at that data, how to interpret it. And I suspect those ones who are open to that way of thinking are more likely to succeed, versus those ones that are kind of still trying to, I'm going to try and force this data into my mental model of how things used to be, are the ones that are continuing to kind of, well, the way that they might explain, or you might observe their behavior, might be, gosh, I'm glad, we've reopened, we're back to normal. These kind of sentiments are saying that you're not back to normal. We're in a new temporary normal, and we don't know where the next new temporary normal might be. But you're not looking at the data in a informed way. You're looking at it in a misinformed way now.
Yeah, and I completely agree with Gary, right? I was just talking to someone from York region yesterday, and they've been talking about, even from a small to medium businesses point of view, if you take a look at the local markets, right? They've been worried about this sort of modified stage two, as they're calling it, right? What would happen? Now you're kind of shifting back from that, okay, we were normal in stage three, now we're going back. And this actually brings me to a question that Ramya Mario has asked. So Mario is asking, when you can, give us some examples of those innovative ways of collecting feedback from the end user.
Oh, sure. And before I forget, something I wanted to point out. So, when we talk about observing patterns, it's again, moving you towards the same old, concept of developing some sort of a preconceived notion about users. So you're not directly interacting with the user, but what you're actually doing is that based on some mathematical modeling, you're coming up with some sort of preconceived notion. And that is exactly what the design thinking does not say don't use data, but use data wisely
Right.
and
Cluster it.
collect data from the right sources,
Right.
which is your end user, instead of having or developing preconceived notions. And this is the point in history, or in our lives, that that we are more susceptible to developing those preconceived notions, because we don't know what we don't know. And I feel that during pandemic, especially COVID-19, there has been a disruption, and we have to take time. And this I'm sure this question cannot be answered in just one session,
Hmm.
because it would take a lot of innovative ideas to come up with some way of directly getting the feedback from the user. The point is that design thinking, there are two things. One is that you get the feedback from the users as fast as possible. And the second element is to protect yourself from falling prey to preconceived notions. These are the
Right.
two things that is important when we talk about uh, design thinking, especially during the time of, let's say, a pandemic or a disruptive
Yeah.
change.
You're absolutely right, Ramya. And if I put a bit more color on this myself, so most of my work experience, similar to you, probably Ramya as well, comes from larger, right, medium to large type organizations. Like Loblaw, I would consider it maybe in the scheme of the world, bit medium to large, but in Canada, it's large organization.
Mm.
But if you look at the small to medium businesses, especially in Canada where we are, they've probably gone through the most amount of change compared to anybody else, right, at this point. So, Mario, if I think about your question, right, it's very specific to what the current state was that you started with at the start of COVID. So let's take an example of a store that completely relied on the foot traffic in retail, right? And then if you compare it with where they might be now, they may have changed the way that they do business. So they may have gone more online. They may have gone to, with an Amazon store, a Shopify store, whatever have you. So right away, the way that you interact with your customers has already changed. You're on a completely new, different channel now. And even that channel is continuing to evolve outside of your control. I'm sure that during this time, Shopify has been very busy pulling out more features, more analytics, more dashboards for their store owners, right? So if you think about it from that perspective, there's more data, and as Ramya said, more information coming at you. It's more about how you look at that data, and instead of making assumptions, how you challenge that and how you test those assumptions, whether using your current channel or maybe even trying some new channels, right? So it depends. Probably that's a very tough question to answer because there needs to be more context around it, right, Ramya? That's why you said that it's such a big question to answer in just one session, because you probably
Exactly.
need to take different case studies and different industries would have different answers to that. But one thing that's common, at least in my experience, is everybody's congregating somewhere online right now. If you think about every city, wherever you are, has a downtown and there's a main street, right? Where everybody kind of goes to the weekend. Internet is that's main street right now. So the question then becomes, who am I going to find? Where am I going to find them? What are they complaining about? Because if I can solve that problem, I could probably figure out how to deliver that quickly and make it create more value for everyone, right? So we're going a bit off topic now, but it's a very important question that we all should be asking within our companies, right? At the very least, with that context on. Um, so maybe back to Ramya. I know I interrupted you before. I think you were just about to go into prototype phase.
Yeah, so I think I explained about prototyping. And another
Okay.
thing, it's just that these discussions are so beautiful that just drawing my attention towards this. Like, because there are so many different aspects of retail, for example. So one is your e-commerce, and we have to observe. So the first observation would be how the focus has shifted from brick and mortar, shops in general, to, let's say, e-commerce, sort of online shopping and all. And that's the greatest change that we have observed. And how will our business adopt to that? So how do we come up with suitable, let's say, um, applications that help them, that make their experience, their online experience, better? Because we have seen a sea shift. So that is one observation, and there's no bias surrounding this. It's an unequivocal sort of an observation that we have made. The second observation is in terms of, like, how do I make my applications relevant, given the regulations and the restrictions, like anything for that matter. How do I make my business in general relevant in this particular era, or in this particular, at this point in time, where there's so many restrictions from the government, from the healthcare institutions? So these are some of the things that are unequivocal, cannot be challenged. And what we got to do is start working on these unequivocal ideas or things that we have observed, observations. And then, as and when we start getting the feedback from the users, we start adding more features to our application or our platforms. So I would say that another thing that can help us at this point would be making this process of design thinking, that 5-step process that I was talking about, making it as quick as possible, so that we are able to adapt to the changing beliefs, our changing beliefs about users. And that's purely influenced by their specific interactions with us, not based on our preconceived notions.
Yeah, and at this point, Tammy Tope, I hope I'm saying that name right, has a thought as well, right? So design thinking itself has to be combined with other concepts such as MVP, short feedback cycle from end users, by constantly engaging to really get the benefit.
Yes, absolutely. So it's again a very beautiful statement that he has made. And I think it's more relevant when it comes to a situation where we don't know what's going to happen. So we have to be very quick and agile. Yeah.
Absolutely. It ties back to that unpredictability which the pandemic brings, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So these are some of the user studies. I know you might have encountered so many different, you can say, statistics. Although I am a data-driven person, but then I don't particularly believe in these sort of statistics. But then I do feel that there is the concept of design thinking is very powerful, and it's very relevant to the time that we are in, especially a pandemic time, where all our prior beliefs about the users have been shattered, and we got to have, form new understanding about our users. And that's where we have to be innovative right now. Yes.
Absolutely. And to be honest, like, just looking at the first sentence that you have on the slide about the loyalty, right? From a customer loyalty point of view, I wonder if the definition of loyalty itself has changed now.
Exactly. So that's why I thought of, going over these specific points, and I chose loyalty because for retail and customer centric, I would say, industry, loyalty is very important. You don't want your users, the customer churn is the last thing that you would want, because it's extremely expensive to get new customers, right? So I would say that, of course, like in the past, we have, of course, observed that 50% of the design-led companies have reported more loyalty from customers. So, and also, I believe in having a very positive work culture, And it seems that 71% of the organizations that practice design thinking, they have reported improvement in work culture. Now that's because you are having these sessions where you're working on real data and data about the user, your end user, and you're ideating. You're so you so those are particularly good sessions. You're not being told what to create, but you're coming up with ideas. Everyone is contributing to the process, and that's why
Absolutely.
it's contributing to the positive work culture. And the other one is 10% of the Fortune 500 have stated design as number one priority. Yes,
Yeah.
design is the most important element of any sort of product that you're giving or providing your users with. So if you design something which is not usable, which your user does not want, I'm afraid it won't be accepted, and your product would be a total failure. And you're all so it's that particular part of the product which has to be given a lot of emphasis, which is the design.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mario just commented he would like to have these links. So Mario, I think Zoom is kind of freaking out on me a bit right now. I can see the comments coming in, but I can't respond to them. So I'll make sure that you get a copy of Ramya's slides with links on them, and we'll also be sharing the recording of this video. And Biju also says you have to explain the journey the users will go on through, or else they will feel that they are in the meetings all the time. Results being shown consistently helps for sure. Absolutely. There has to be a constant feedback loop, not just with the customer, but internally as well, right, Ramya? To make sure that
Yes.
people are on the right path.
Yes, of course. So I think that's exactly why the processes cannot be linear. They cannot be like one way path. It's like you get feedback from everyone. You get feedback from your users, and you also get feedback from the people who are creating it. Because it's just that a true developer would know how to critique his work, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that it's so beautiful. The concept is like you look at it, you observe, you learn, you observe and learn. That's the basic element when you talk about that. That's the basic thing that you're hitting at when you talk about design thinking in general.
Right.
You observe and you learn and then you react, right?
Yeah, and Park agrees with you and with Biju, right? So it's that concept of diving right into the solution, but not talking about the story or the journey. I think the focus right now needs to be very much on creating a business model or the internal management model that allows you to focus on that journey piece. And to be honest, we have seen innovation and productivity tools, everybody being remote like there's no tomorrow. In our previous session, which Giri hosted, Transforming with ML, we actually sort of touched upon the innovation we have seen in Microsoft Teams and some of these other tools that sort of eliminate the need for these meetings, right? If you can find a way to share information productively, I should say, in real time, and capture your colleagues' feedback as you're working on whatever project it is that you've involved in design thinking, right? Instead of being stuck on that one end state that you think is the North Star, as people like to say, or the Bible, you can challenge yourself and course correct yourself. And that's the whole point of design thinking, right? With the prototyping phase, especially being an iterative phase in itself.
Yes, I think uh, when we talk about prototyping and testing, it's bringing out that element of MVP, minimal viable product, an agile way of working. Because
Mhm.
when you do it fast, and I would like to also highlight this that and this actually happens, and it's not that it's tough to implement. So in the D school that I was talking about at Stanford, it's a program for just 10 weeks.
Mhm.
And it's not that they work on one product, they work on several products, and they're supposed to complete it in within a matter of weeks. So think about this process happening so quickly. So
Right.
when people can do that in let's say a small, let's say, coursework a graduate level coursework, I'm sure we could all do it as an enterprise at the enterprise level.
Yeah, we have to be more nimble for sure.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah. So this actually brings us to Ramya, if you remember, this was actually in September. It was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, which feels forever long ago now. We had done a poll and we had asked in Ontario, in Canada, where Ramya and I are both located, and I think some of you are there as well, recognizing some of the names on the attendees list. We were just actually talking about being on the cusp of wave two, but we've actually gone further ahead now. We're back in stage two in Ontario, which basically means we're acknowledging that wave two is here. And there's a need to take a step back and close certain things again to try and evaluate what's happening with COVID again, because there was so much rise in the cases, right? So we were talking about how would design thinking actually enable specific innovation for Canadian businesses? So this goes back to the question that Mario had actually asked earlier, a version of this, right? How would you find out what the user needs are in an innovative way now? And ironically enough, that's what the response was from the poll: focus on changing user needs. So I think what that tells me is that this is actually part of the design thinking process itself, how you're going to reach out to your users and maybe even redefine what that user group means to you, right? And then the second part we see there's enabling the remote work collaboration, both of which are points that you've touched upon. Ramya, any additional thoughts there?
Yes. So this is very interesting because it reminds me of one particular example. It's a small anecdote, and I'll be very short. It seems that there is a particular program, like stream of products that D School comes up with, and they call it as the extreme affordability. So, um, so in that program, what they do is that they go to these developing countries and try to understand the needs of the people. So it seems that one of those teams had gone to a remote part of India, and they had supposedly identified lack of clean water as one of the pressing needs of the people. But then when they started interacting with the people, they came to know that water was not the absolutely stressful thing for them. And it was actually the kerosene, that the availability of kerosene oil to light the lamps. And that was more pressing or stressful for them, getting those, the kerosene oil. So that helped them understand that, okay, so they were concentrating on something not correct, and then they had to change their perception. And of course they were backed by user feedback, and then they've developed this light. They call that as D-light. They developed these small lamps which were powered by solar power, and then they totally obviated the need for having this kerosene oil in the first place.
Right.
So the focus on changing user need, it just, that example, it reminds me of that.
Yeah,
So
go back to the basics, right? Basic
exactly,
conversation. Yeah.
exactly. And you have to adapt yourself or prepare yourself to exactly, what do you call that, to be, um, to be flexible enough to to understand that the user needs are changing, perceive it, and try to react to it, right? So you have to be nimble, you have to be flexible. So that's the main business which you need to think about during
Right.
COVID-19. Yeah.
And Paul says in the comments, design thinking, system thinking, SIT, etc., are all thinking tools and are really important, but they are tools for the craftsman to use to achieve the desired outcomes. This is why I think it is what you do with the insight and apply a structured approach to plan what needs to be done to improve what you have without causing unintended emergent behaviors. right? So I think that's a very true statement, right? It doesn't matter what type of methodology or framework you plug in. At the end of the day, it has to bring you to that point. You have to benefit the person that you're working with. And sometimes that person doesn't know what, how to articulate their needs, right? So you have to work with them, with your economies of scale, with the skill set that you bring, identify what the true need there is to continue that discussion moving forward. So I definitely agree with that, Paul. Yeah, so I know we're actually running short on time, but Ramya, if you have a few more minutes and if the audience has a few more minutes, I would love for us to continue a bit more conversation. It does look like at this point, the case study that Ramya, you had prepared, we may need to do another session. But there's so much excitement for design thinking. I'm very curious for another discussion.
Sure. I mean, I made the toy example so that we interactively try to solve. It's a very fun problem. It's about children gaining weight during the pandemic situation. I'm sure adults have their own stories of agony, but then it's how do you design an app for children to lose weight, the kids,
Yeah,
So
so I'll book another hour for us to definitely deep dive into that, and we'll share that with this group if you guys are interested. But in the last few minutes, let's talk about how design thinking comes into play during the transformation. So we'll make this the last slide, but feel free to send us your questions, comments in the chat. Go ahead, Ramya.
Sure. So when you talk about change, and what we have been historically observing is a very gradual change that happens over time, right? So evolution of humankind, that's a change because it's gradual. But what is a transformation, and when does transformation occur? So when you have drastic changes, for example, there is an economic recession, there is pandemic, you have natural disasters, you have geopolitical instability. That's when there is a very abrupt change, right? And then that dramatic change that happens, it warrants a transformation, something that totally changes our belief about our end users, totally disrupts that. And I think we have adequately uh, touched upon this point during our discussion, which is how to address this. It's the way we react to something drastic, being quick, being
Right.
nimble, and being agile. So you come up with the same thing that you were implementing. Let's say you're taking 6 months to implement, you have to do that in a month's time, because you don't know what to expect and you don't know how your users needs are changing. So whatever insight you get, you try to develop something and try to test it as fast as possible,
Right.
so that you are in line with your customers as soon as possible. That's how I would term it as.
Yeah, and that's very true. And Park says on the comments that she has heard the weight gain can be called quarantine 15. And she says that they've managed the weight within their family, but through engaging mornings and fangirling from Denver. So that's very true. Actually, if you're lucky enough to be in a place where there's nature around, although I would like to see how that pans out in winter, right? When you can't get outside as much. So for those of us that are not fans of snow, even though we live in Canada, myself included, I would definitely have to figure that one out for sure. So I know we're at time now. It's such an engaging conversation. I want to especially thank Ramya and everybody else for sharing your time with us. I'm definitely going to schedule another session with Ramya, and I'll be emailing you the video recording, the slides we have shared with you so far, as well as a link to the follow-up session if you would like to join us. And Park actually says she joins us from Thailand, and that's amazing, right? That's a worldwide conversation. I love that. So many different perspectives. So thank you so much again for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again. Have a great day and stay safe, everyone. Thank you, Ramya.
Thank you. Yeah. Keep safe. Thank you.